This morning's lecture is made possible by the Helen C. Lincoln Fund International Programming. Mrs. Lincoln was instrumental in persuading Senator Barry Goldwater to speak at Chautauqua in 1964, and her descendants continue to be deeply involved in Chautauqua. We thank the Lincoln family for their support, as we thank all of your families who support Chautauqua. Thank you. This morning's speaker is Jon B. Alterman. Dr. Alterman is Senior Vice President, holds the Zbigniew Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy, and is Director of Middle East Programs at CSIS. Previously, he served as a member of the policy planning staff at the U.S. Department of State and as a special assistant to the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. Before entering government, Dr. Alterman was a scholar at the U.S. Institute of Peace and at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Beyond his policy work, Dr. Alterman also teaches at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and at the George Washington University, and he was also an award-winning teacher at Harvard University. Dr. Alterman worked as a legislative aide on foreign policy and defense for Senator Daniel P. Moynihan, who was a New York senator, and has authored or co-authored 4 books on the Middle East and edited even more. He's contributed to the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, is a member of the Editorial Advisory Board of Arab Media and Society, and is a former International Affairs Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he is now a life member. Dr. Alterman received his bachelor's degree from Princeton University and his PhD from Harvard University. He's joined on his second Chautauqua visit by his wife, Kathy LaRiviere, and their children, Bella and Jeb, and a nice dog, Toby. His lecture today is titled The Middle East Amidst a Storm. So, ladies and gentlemen, Middle East peacemakers, thinkers, activists, and just plain smart people, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jon Alterman back to the Chautauqua platform.
Thank you very much, Shara. It is both a great honor and a great joy to be back here at Chautauqua. Congratulations on this magnificent new amphitheater. When my parents learned I was coming, they became very excited about coming this week to hear me. They were planning on coming until last week when my mom had a health setback. I send my mother my love and my best wishes, and I send my gratitude to the Chautauqua staff for ensuring that the live streaming is working. Thank you. What I want to talk to you today is about the ferocity of the Middle East. There are civil wars in Syria and in Yemen. There is civil war in Libya. There are insurgencies in Iraq and Egypt. And you could argue there are rising tensions almost everywhere else. We see refugees in the Middle East, terrorism, organized crime, and these things don't only affect the Middle East, they spread to Europe, they spread around the world. But to explain the ferocity in the Middle East, I want to start by telling you about a tree. When I bought my house in 1999, there was a large pin oak in the front yard. And by large, I mean this thing was huge. It was shaped like a pin with a long, tall trunk that suddenly opened into this huge leaf canopy that covered my front yard, much of my neighbor's front yard, and half of my roof. The trunk was more than 7 feet around, and when you looked up, the top of the tree seemed to touch the sky. It's hard to say how tall it was, but it was certainly taller than any of the trees behind us in Bester Plaza. While dating living trees is imprecise, my guess is this thing was more than 100 years old, and it was certainly at least twice as old as the house. And we tried to have a garden under this tree, but it's hard because there was so much shade under the tree, not much light got in, and every fall we had this thick carpet of leaves that kept anything from growing no matter how much we tried to rake it. And so we had a few impatiens, some hostas and some ferns, but we had to have like a little garden bench to brighten it up because it's hard to grow anything under this tree. 5 years ago, on the night of June 29th, it all changed. June 29th in Washington was the hottest June day in the history of recorded temperatures in Washington, D.C., 104 degrees. There was a heat dome over the southern United States. It covered 25 states and the District of Columbia. The weather reports that afternoon said that there was likely to be rain that evening, and that would give us a little respite from the temperatures. But that afternoon, when the borders of that heat dome came up against cooler weather to the north, they mixed with fast-moving air in the jet stream, and that combination produced what's called a derecho storm, which started in Indiana shortly after lunch and traveled 600 miles before it slammed into Washington, D.C. at about 11 p.m. At home, the rain slapped against the windows. The winds reached 80 miles an hour. Thunder shook the house. Lightning lit it up. And suddenly there was a massive crack as if the lightning had hit something. I went back to sleep. That's true. We'd expected to lose power, but what we hadn't prepared us for was our front yard, or really what our front yard used to be, because instead of our front yard, we saw part of the tree canopy covering everything. Huge branches formed an impenetrable maze. We worked with hours with a neighbor and a chainsaw, and we were finally able to clear a path to the street and clear out the driveway, and it was still brutally hot. The tree had taken out our power line, which meant we didn't have air conditioning, we wouldn't have air conditioning. And if you have a power line down, that's a problem, except nobody had electricity anywhere. Washington was in total blackout. A couple days later, power starts to come back. We went to a local mall that we heard had power, and it was jammed. Partly, customers were like us, seeking relief from the heat. But scattered all over the floor were these small clusters of impromptu communities that were huddled around power strips. And people were plugging in their computers and their phones, sending messages saying, "I'm hot, but I'm in a mall, it's okay. I don't know when I'm getting power back." This was weird. I never realized how many outlets there were in a mall. They're all over the floor, so you can clean the place. It was this really disorienting experience. Totally disorienting. Destructive storms like this derecho often arise when several weather systems collide. The most famous of them is probably the so-called perfect storm of 1991. That was off the East Coast in October. It occurred when the dying winds of Hurricane Grace collided with both a Canadian storm that came down from the north and a low-pressure system moving up the Atlantic coast. As the triple storm, now 3 storms coming together, gathered moisture over warm water near Bermuda, the new storm produced rain, winds in excess of 100 miles an hour, and 100-foot waves. The so-called perfect storm, a lot of people think, was the harshest Atlantic storm in a century, and at least in the movie version, that thing killed George Clooney. What I want you to hold in your mind is that thought about 3 storm systems coming together, because it seems to me that's what's happening in the Middle East now. Countries are facing 3 sets of challenges. First, a set of daunting internal challenges. Second, a set of formidable external challenges. And third, a profound crisis of confidence brought on by the uprisings and revolutions of 2011 and a sense of imminent Western abandonment. In an earlier age, each one of these disruptions alone would have been enough to provoke widespread crisis. Now they're happening all at once, amplifying, reinforcing, and building on top of each other. The so-called Arab Spring demonstrated just how connected Arab politics often can be. And thanks to these disruptions, my argument is that the next decade will show us how different Arab politics can be from state to state. Governments will continue to learn from each other, but oppositions will learn from each other as well. And the outside world will grow more confounding. Hundreds of millions of people are going to be caught between the warring sides. So first, let me talk to you about internal challenges. And I want to talk about 4 in particular. The first internal challenge that every country in the Middle East is dealing with is a demographic challenge. The Middle East as a region has a shockingly young population. The population of the Arab world doubled in the 3 decades after 1980, and now more than 2/3 of Arabs are under 30. Think about that. More than 2/3 of Arabs are under 30. The number in the European Union is 1/3. So the Arab world is twice as young as Europe. A youthful population can be a source of strength if they're engaged in education and the economy. But according to The Economist, youth unemployment averages 30% across the Arab world. Almost 3 million young people enter the job market every year, but there are only 2 million jobs. That's a lot of people sitting around. Even more worryingly, the longer a male student spends in school, the less likely he is to find employment. That's strange. The longer you're in school, the less likely you are to find jobs. Yeah, because the high-skilled jobs are scarcer. And so people say, why should I stay in school? Because if I stay in school, then I'll spend more time looking for a job. I'll just drop out of school and start working. It's different for women. But for men, the longer you're in school, the harder it will be to find a job. So people get disappointed and resentful. That's natural. That's a problem that affects every Arab country. The second challenge that Middle Eastern states have, people in Middle Eastern states have, is a lack of governmental capacity. Now, you could look at the Middle East and say, wow, look at how far these countries have come, because a lot of them were nothing but sandpits 50 years ago. And it's true. In 1950, Saudi Arabia had about 200 kilometers of paved roads, no functioning airports, no railroads. Today, it has 47,000 kilometers worth of roads, 1,300 kilometers of railways, 214 airports. The kingdom, which had no public schools in 1950, now employs more than 300,000 teachers to teach 3.5 million primary and secondary students. Virtually all Saudis have access to drinking water and sanitation. The government's created rules and regulations to govern a modern $1.6 trillion economy, and they've built an army, they built an internal security apparatus. I mean, arguably, Saudi Arabia, for a country that had nothing in 1950, has a lot. But what they have isn't enough, because they're trying to compete on a global stage. They need to attract international partners. They need to retain their most talented citizens. They need to manage the daily interactions with millions and tens of millions of people across fields like healthcare, water, sanitation, social services, and they have to do so in a world that's moving at lightning speed. The old tools and old bureaucracies of all these governments across the Middle East just isn't up to the task. Not up to the task of dealing with the complexity and the speed of modern life. The third set of challenges is economic. And I think the most important thing to understand about Middle Eastern economies is how every government in the Middle East, every country in the Middle East, every economy in the Middle East is tied to the price of oil. You say, that's weird because there are just a certain number of oil producers and we know those guys and they're the ones worried about oil. But actually everybody's worried about oil because either oil represents a large part of your government revenue or because you export workers to countries that produce oil and they send money back and you get money in terms of remittances, or wealthy countries that produce oil give you government assistance as aid. So every Middle Eastern economy, whether you produce oil or not, every Middle Eastern economy is tied to the price of oil, which for those of you who drive cars, you know is way down from what it was. Oil is just under $50 a barrel. It is likely to stay under $50 a barrel. That's down from more than $100 a barrel in 2014. Now, in Iraq, in 2014, oil represented 90% of government revenues. In Yemen, which produces 1/30th the amount of oil of Iraq, half the government's revenue came from oil in 2014. What happens when the price of oil goes down? Suddenly, everybody's economy is squeezed. Oil's not the only problem in Middle Eastern economies. That is, the low price of oil isn't the only problem. They have bloated public sectors, they have large subsidy programs, they have a weak banking system. There are lots of problems, but oil makes all these problems not only worse, but the sudden drop in the price of oil makes these problems acute in a way they wouldn't have otherwise been. That's three. The fourth one I want to talk about is information. Information spreads now faster than any time in human history. And for governments that are used to controlling information, this is a very uncomfortable environment. Syria, for many years, had probably the worst press in the Arab world. And I sort of capture this in December 2003, the day Saddam Hussein was captured. The day after, I flew from Riyadh to Damascus. And I remember seeing the Saudi newspaper, and it was 2/3 of the front page was covered with a picture of Saddam Hussein saying he was captured. Big news. And I'm on the plane, and I pick up the Syrian newspaper, Al-Ba'ath, and I'm looking for how they covered the capture of Saddam Hussein. And it's not there. I said, well, that's strange. So I start reading through the articles, and I realized that the article I needed to pay attention to was Bashar al-Assad says Syria's policy will remain unchanged. And when you read the jump, that is the continuation of that article, it sort of parenthetically mentions inside the paper, oh, by the way, Saddam Hussein was captured yesterday. The games that governments play with the news media have changed. When I was in Damascus in 1991, the only way to get real news was to buy this international newspaper published out of London, printed by satellite, called Al-Hayat. Really good newspaper. And I picked one up in Damascus because I was tired of reading Al-Ba'ath and Tushrin and the other newspapers they have. And I pick up the newspaper and look at the front page, and there are articles that have been cut out with a razor blade. They didn't black it out. They didn't black out what they didn't want. They cut it out with a razor blade. The fact is, you can't play that game anymore. Governments that are used to playing that game, governments that are used to controlling what people see and hear, can't play the game because people watch television, more than 800 free-to-air satellite television stations in the Arab world. They're on the internet, they're on Twitter. 20% of Saudis are active users of Twitter. So you can censor all you want, but can you really keep people from learning things? And Saudi Arabia also has the highest per capita YouTube use in the world. So you can ban theaters and public gatherings, but people are still learning things. And so for governments that got used to controlling information as a way of controlling people, you can't play that game anymore, and you'll never be able to play it again. And that's very disorienting. Those are the internal challenges. This world is changing, and they're struggling to catch up. Let me talk to you now about external challenges. The first is every Arab state I'm aware of feels a certain amount of threat from Iran, which after all is a non-Arab Persian state, not only because the fall of Saddam Hussein gave Iran tremendous influence in Iraq, but Iran has also abetted the brutal civil war in Syria. It sent arms and advisors to support the Houthi rebels in Yemen, provided billions of dollars of assistance to Hezbollah in Lebanon, where it operates a state within a state. It's provided hundreds of millions of dollars to Hamas and Islamic Jihad, often for weapons. Gulf states, including Kuwait and Bahrain, have found evidence that Iranian intelligence operatives are supporting violent groups there. What I keep hearing when I talk to Arab foreign ministers is the claim that Iran controls 4 Arab capitals: Beirut, Damascus, Baghdad, and Sana'a in Yemen. They don't control them, but Iran has influence, and Iran loves to remind people what I always call station identification. They love to remind people that I can touch you and you will feel it. And Iran is all over the region doing that all the time. But Iran is only the beginning of external forces that governments are concerned with, not the end. Like an aggressive franchisor, ISIS, or ISIL, or Daesh, or the Islamic State group, whatever you want to call them, the roots were laid in Jordan 20 years ago. They got affiliates all over the Middle East. Al-Qaeda and its affiliates are still active across the Middle East as well. And there's an array of like-minded terrorist groups like Ansar al-Sharia, Jabhat Fath Hashem, located in Tunisia and Syria, respectively. These terrorist organizations ultimately feed on the weakness of central governments, and they weaken central governments by drawing scarce security resources, sabotaging economies, and polarizing populations. And the fact is, these groups are becoming more and more international. Probably 100,000 people were fighting with ISIS in Syria. Some of them go home, they have new friends, they have new skills. They're all over the place. And for Middle Eastern governments, some of whom have seen thousands of people go, if dozens come back, that represents a serious security problem. The attraction of these groups to a lot of people lies in their skillful use of tried and true methods to exploit local social, economic, or political grievances. And addressing those grievances, that is, the internal set of issues we talked about before, is really, really hard. So we've got the internal challenges, we've got the external challenges. Then there's the uncertainty challenge. And the uncertainty challenge is in many ways the hardest one because it's kind of psychological. How do you deal with somebody's psychology? It's always hard to do, and it's hard in the Middle East. Simply put, the region is racked with uncertainty about how people and states will behave in the wake of these 2001 uprisings and how the rest of the world is going to treat the Middle East. The so-called Arab Spring represented a flash of hope to many people when it began. It brought together people who were young and people who were old, and the religious and the secular and the rich and the poor, and they gathered in main squares and they expressed their love for their country and their hope for a better future. And it unleashed this incredible creativity and dynamism, especially among young people. For Arab governments, this was a shock because they thought they had figured out their populations. They thought they had this. They have their security systems, they have their surveillance, they can control it, and then clearly they were not in control. The speed with which these movements developed, the depth of emotion they evoked were unprecedented. What's happened in the last 5 years is that governments that thought they had a handle on their populations suddenly think, maybe I don't have a handle on this population. In countries that underwent political change, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, and elsewhere, prisons were emptied in the chaos. Police forces lost their nerve for a while, and it's been hard to reestablish control. The common refrain from protesters in a lot of these countries is, we have lost our fear. But criminals, thugs, and extremists lost their fear too, and they're making a bigger bid for influence in all of these countries. That's the internal piece of losing your confidence, but the external piece matters too. The outside world, after pouring more than $1 trillion into the Iraq war, hundreds of billions of dollars into trying to resolve other regional conflicts through the years, I don't know how all of you feel, but when I talk to people, a lot of Americans say, you know what? Unconventional oil and gas, the rise in oil production in the United States is generally the number 2 oil producer in the world. People think it's going to go back to number 1. We're producing more oil and gas now than we ever have in our history. You know what that means? We can push the Middle East aside. We don't need to be engaged in that stuff anymore because we don't need the oil anymore, and we're free. We produce almost 10 million barrels of oil a day. And as I say, that puts us kind of where Saudi Arabia is, and Sarah Ladislaw can tell you more about this tomorrow. For most Middle Eastern governments, if the U.S. were to pull out of its traditional role in the Middle East, which it's maintained since the 1940s, it would be an earthquake. Saudi Arabia has been heavily reliant on U.S. security guarantees since the Roosevelt administration. And as a Saudi friend explained to me about 4 years ago, he looked and said, not only do we not have the people or institutions to craft an alternative security strategy, we don't have an alternative. We don't have an alternative, and we don't have the people or institutions to craft an alternative. There's no way we can conceptualize an alternative if the U.S. were to pull out. And yet, there was a feeling in the Obama administration that's precisely what the U.S. was trying to do. I should say that this sense of reliance on the United States, the inability to think of an alternative, was precisely what the United States was trying to create for 70 years. That's the situation we wanted them to be in, the situation they felt, we need you. And now, they say, well, what if the United States doesn't need us? Then what do we do? Then what do we do? If the United States were to pull out of the Middle East, there's no obvious inheritor to the U.S. mantle. Now, it's true that 67% of oil from the Gulf goes to Asia. But there's no Asian military with either the capacity or the interest to play the role of a dominant military power the way the United States has, or the United Kingdom used to, or the way the Ottomans used to before them. European militaries are a shadow of their former selves, and the reality is Russia can't build anything. Russia can only obstruct stuff. It's true. Should have a Russia talk. Anyway. And finally, and this is the last sort of level of uncertainty, there's no question in anybody's mind that the oil age is going to come to an end. It's not going to be this year. It's not going to be 10 years from now. But almost certainly, if you have young populations, all the young people feel in their lifetime the oil age is going to come to an end. And then what? And then what? What happens to the region when the economies and the governments and all the geopolitical ties are reliant on having this resource that the world wants to secure, and then suddenly the world doesn't need it? How does that affect their lives? How does it affect their countries? These three disruptions, a set of internal challenges, a set of external challenges, and this deep uncertainty about how they will engage with the world and how the world will engage with them, have created a perfect storm. It seemed like only yesterday that the skies in the Middle East seemed calm and predictable. We don't really remember it now, but in the 90s and the 2000s, all of the Middle Eastern countries seemed to be converging in a lot of ways. Superficially, the region was divided into monarchies and republics. But in reality, all of the monarchies had at least pro forma legislatures. The republics kind of had pro forma legislatures too. Every president had a son who wanted dad's job. So it was kind of like a monarchy anyway, right? And they kind of agreed on economics too. They agreed on strong social safety net, strong role for the government in promoting industry, large public sector. I mean, they kind of all had converged on the same idea of what the future should look like. Security policies converged. Nobody thought they could do censorship anymore. Everybody wrapped their head around the idea that paying people to sit in rooms with black magic markers doesn't make sense. Politics converged because everybody said, it's good to have some people who feel that they're the opposition and understand that part of the rules is that you're not allowed to actually compete for power. You're just allowed to make noise and let people know you're in opposition. My favorite data point on this is in the last presidential elections in Egypt. Number one vote getter was Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the current president. The number two vote getter was not his opponent, Hamdin Sabahi. The number two vote getter was spoiled ballots. And then number three was the guy who was actually running for the job. You're not allowed to honestly oppose. And everybody was understanding that rule too. But in the wake of the Arab uprisings, the convergence among the Arab states has ended. And I think the states were always a little bit different, and the differences are coming out. These are different places. Not only are some very rich and some very poor. Qatar has about 300,000 citizens, highest per capita income in the world. That's 10% of the populations of the Cairo neighborhood of Shobra, which has 3 million people. How do you compare a country with 300,000 people and a country with 90 million people where you can put the entire population into a neighborhood and nobody would notice? Expatriates are less than 1% of the population in Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, and Algeria, about 90% of the population of Qatar and the UAE. These countries have increasingly different political systems, economic resources, and levels of cultural and social cohesion as well. Politically, in Morocco, the Justice and Development Party plays a leading role in political life. It controls several key ministries. It regularly wins the plurality in elections. In Tunisia, Islamists still struggle to regain the leadership role they had shortly after the government of Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali fell in 2011. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamist party, principal Islamist party, remains outlawed, and the Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party is banned. While the United Arab Emirates has steadily increased the size of its electorate over the last decade, candidates run as independents rather than as on party lists. And that's true in Kuwait as well. Palestine has not held parliamentary or presidential elections for more than a decade, in part because of a conflict between the two main parties, Fatah and Hamas. Economically, we see these huge divergencies. Wealthier states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE are seeking to use government funds to drive industrialization and build employment. Saudi Arabia's ambitious 2030 plan envisions strong growth in manufacturing It targets spending 50% of defense procurement dollars in Saudi Arabia in 14 years. The current percentage, from 2 to 50 in 14 years, building an entire defense industry, extraordinarily ambitious. It will require a massive investment in skills and infrastructure. Even to miss that target will require a huge investment. The UAE has taken a more modest approach. It's tried to do cheap things on a lower level. The governments are taking divergent approaches to their economic conditions. In Algeria, they're trying to maintain the social safety net as much as possible. In Egypt, the IMF came in with a rescue package, which is requiring Egypt to cut a lot of its traditional subsidies. And then you have problems in countries like Syria. How do you even think about the process of Syrian reconstruction, which after all has to start with the idea of who controls what territory, who will control what territory. Do you want to strengthen the government of Bashar al-Assad or push it aside? I mean, the diversity in this region is incredible, and there's a question of governmental capacity. Governments are weak partly because they haven't existed to do stuff. They've existed to give people jobs. You give jobs to your friends, you give jobs to your relatives, you give jobs to members of your tribe, you give jobs to people who are from your village, whatever it is. The point of the government wasn't to be strong. The point of the government was to funnel wealth and security to important political supporters. How do you transition from that to having to deal with the complexity of the modern world when all these things are swirling around is a real problem? And even when you say, well, the government's all incompetent, you can't just sweep the incompetent people out, because what we found out not only in Saddam Hussein's Iraq after Saddam fell, but in Egypt when the Muslim Brotherhood pushed out all the Mubarak cronies, it turns out that the political hacks are even worse than the old bureaucrats were at getting things done. And so there wasn't reliable electricity, and there wasn't reliable water, and all those things. So this is a challenge to deal with this set of transitions that has to happen. It's a very slow and uncertain one, and a lot of countries are starting from a low base. One of the things that struck me when I was in Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, about 2008, the government systematically destroyed institutions because the government's considered any capable institution is a threat to the government. So it helped keep Muammar Gaddafi in power. But when you think about how do you create stability after Muammar Gaddafi, you don't have people either in institutions or able to work in institutions to make this work. I still remember we did a Track 2 meeting, that is a sort of unofficial but informed group of people coming together to talk about things, and the person leading the Libyan delegation said, I have to talk to you, we have to go to a separate place, I have to have a private conversation. Okay. So we go to a different hotel, and we're sitting in the bar, and she hands me this cable that somebody else on the delegation had written. And it's all complaining about her. And I'm thinking, am I like missing nuances in the Arabic? Why would somebody share with me 2 pages of complaints about how incompetent she is? And so I finally get up the courage, and again, I'm like, I must not be understanding something. So I say, why do you want me to see this? And she says, look, it's riddled with factual errors. That guy's not a senator, he's a former ambassador who complained about me. And so what she was complaining about was nitpicking on the details of the complaints about things she had done wrong, because she didn't understand how to work in an organization and get along and how to cooperate with the other people she was on the delegation with. They were busy sniping at each other. And when I look at the disarray in Libya, it's not a total shock, because Libyans were trained for 40 years to snipe at each other because that's what their government wanted them to do. Getting beyond that will take an entire process. I don't think, though, that we should have a total perspective of gloom and doom toward the region. Look, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. In countries like Jordan and Egypt, governments have created small pockets of capacity and excellence, even if ministers often complain to me that their ministries are too large. This is one of the fascinating things. Government ministers say, you know what? I would love to have 10% of the people I want. All the US government ministries, they want more people, right? You have a department, you want more people to do stuff. No, they say, I don't want 90%. Our mission is confused. Our payroll is too big. I just want a lean and mean organization. I still remember meeting a minister in Egypt, and he said, there's a function that used to have 160 people doing it. He said, now we have 2, and they do it better than the 160 did. A lot of Arabs from the Levant have gotten experience in the Gulf, and they can go back to the Levant and help bring that expertise there. Once committed to creating and preserving jobs by direct employment, a lot of governments now believe it's more important to provide platforms to encourage job creation. In many ways, creating the required infrastructure like a modern commercial code and investment incentives is cheaper than the old way of doing business. While some see the Middle East's startlingly young population as a liability, it's in many ways an asset. Young people's impatience, restlessness, and creativity, and I appreciate all the young ones who are sitting through this, including my own kids. That impatience, restlessness, and creativity all drive positive change. The rise of technology lets ideas and products spread across borders with unprecedented ease, which is especially important in a large and diverse Arab world that is united by language. None of the Middle East problems are going to go away soon. Civil wars last about a decade on average. Insurgencies often last more than a decade. The Middle East has several of both. It has several insurgencies and several civil wars. They draw volunteers from throughout the region, threatening to export those problems back to the countries of origin when fighters go home. In the so-called Arab Cold War, the 1950s and 60s, there were kind of two models in the Middle East. There was the Gamal Abdel Nasser model of Egypt, favored large-scale Soviet-style government-led industrialization, strong central government, mass mobilization of the public. And the Saudi model, you have a monarchy led by King Abdulaziz ibn Saud and his sons, resource extraction, patronage based on tribal lines, the relative absence of visible politics. Today, by contrast, we see this incredible kaleidoscope of possibilities, constantly changing and refracted under shifting conditions. The Arab consensus of the 1990s and 2000s has decidedly broken, but the polarization of the 50s and 60s hasn't returned. Where there was order, we have what I would argue is going to be lasting disorder. Looking ahead, we'll almost certainly see more volatility in the Middle East than we've seen for a long time. The Middle East had a reputation in the 20th century for instability, but looking back, really by the 1970s, this had become a pretty predictable region. That predictability has totally evaporated. Multiple states confront multiple challenges with divergent capabilities, resources, and skill levels, and we'll surely see very different outcomes. Those outcomes will in turn influence what states do to confront their own challenges, how populations respond. We may find a new equilibrium emerge, and with it a new consensus, but that's at least a decade off from now. This dynamism, I think, helps explain the region's current ferocity. Armed groups have spread into the vacuum created by the unrest of 5 years ago, and they merged in many cases with escaped prisoners. Social uncertainty has driven ideological ferment as many claim a divine mandate for their struggles. With stakes so high and the future so uncertain, governments and oppositions have an added incentive to fight to win. The tantalizing sense of possibility drives action, but among those with slim chances of success, it drives desperation as well. Still, I think it's a mistake to think that the Middle East is going to be subject to a bloody decade. The young and creative population that captivated the world in 2011 is still young and creative, and it's finding outlets in Cairo and Casablanca, in Beirut and Dubai. The agreed need to make wholesale changes is terrifying, but it's also empowering. Analysts wishing to explain, understand, and navigate this turbulent region, I think, have to add two important perspectives to their analytical toolkit. First, I think we have to be more appreciative of the extent to which lessons are understood and transferred from one place to another. Should be one of the things we really take as lessons from the Arab Spring. One of the most striking aspects of all those revolutions was this way that an idea that was spawned in Tunis on a Tuesday could flow to Cairo by Wednesday and to Damascus by Thursday. There's a way in which the ability of a good idea to move, or a bad idea to move, is faster than ever before. And for Arabs speaking Arabic, the national boundaries aren't a boundary. Second, I think we have to really appreciate what the forces of violence understand also well in the Middle East, which is this is a pivotal time. This is the pivotal time. What happens now will have a long impact into the future. It's tempting to look at all this disorder and pull back and say, you have my number, call me when you figure it out. But in the face of uncertainty, I think we have to do more than just muddle through. Where the equilibrium will settle is not dependent on the region's innate qualities, and instead competing forces of change, some from within the region and some from without, will have to reach some balance. Now, 5 years ago, back in Maryland, an electrical team had come all the way from Louisiana and finally restored our power after about a week. A little while after that, we were able to pay a tree company to remove the debris from our yard. The tree couldn't be saved, they said, so they cut it into huge 4-foot sections and loaded it onto trucks and took it away. They ground down the stump, leaving us a pile of wood chips and sawdust. Today, the garden has the same shape it always did, a narrow path coming out to the house, widening to a big 10-foot circle. Where the mighty oak once stood is a little ornamental red Japanese maple. We chose it in part because we didn't want another tree that was going to take down the electrical line to the house. But we also didn't want anything that reminded us too much of the beautiful old tree we had lost. One of the surprising things for us has been how our flower choices have grown. The ferns and hostas that used to be the mainstay of our garden now burn under the sun, but we've got this amazing patch of vincas, and even zinnias are flourishing. Weeds are a bigger problem than they used to be because now they get plenty of light. Our front garden had been a shady retreat, but today these yellows and oranges and shocking pinks are set off against the dark red leaves of the maple. It's a complete riot of color. The garden isn't what it was, and perhaps not what it will be. But after the storm, it couldn't remain as it had been. It's a new garden that thrives under new conditions. We're still learning what works and what doesn't work, but that, after all, is what gardening is all about. Thank you. Okay.
John told me that this was a speech that was written specifically for Chautauqua, and certainly your garden references indicate that, so we thank you for that. And I'm just wondering if the Japanese maple has any symbolism to what's happening in the world about what we're replacing the Near East with.
Wow. Yeah, I've done a lot of work on China and the Middle East. Japan and the Middle East, the Japanese really want American leadership. They want us to lead, and they want to know how they can be helpful. It's striking. It's an interesting alliance, but I think more than other countries, although certainly in the Middle East as well, the people really do want American leadership. The problem is they want you to tell them what leadership is, and they want to like how it sounds, right? So as my grandfather used to say, I reserve the right to criticize. And I think it's a common theme around the world. It wasn't just him.
We've got a couple of questions from Twitter, and those of you who would like to submit your questions by Twitter, including John Alterman's parents, can do so.
Twitter is the avenue they'll use.
It's hashtag CHQ2017. Can you please explain the report of the UAE hacking in Qatar?
I can describe the report of the UAE hacking in Qatar. I can't tell you what the truth of it is. So May 24th, I think, there were news reports that the Emir of Qatar gave a graduation speech where he praised Iran and praised Islamic groups and the governments of the UAE and Saudi Arabia took that as a sort of casus belli and closed their borders with Qatar and ended trade, and they got the Bahrainis and the Egyptians to come on board. They said, look, the Qataris are totally irresponsible. They act irresponsibly in the region. Here's just another example. We all have to gather together and force a change. It's not at all, the initial thing was nobody saw any evidence the Emir had ever given that speech, let alone said those things in the speech. And then a couple days ago, the Washington Post had a story, which I assume was leaked from the State Department and the Defense Department, saying U.S. intelligence had recently learned that the Emiratis actually had planted that news, that they had hacked into Qatari websites and planted the news. I've had a number of different theories about what is actually going on, none of which have actually been borne out. You could argue that this is an effort to provoke a succession crisis in Qatar and get a new leadership. You could argue that this is the prelude to a new government. What I have heard from people in the U.S. intelligence community who, it's hard because they can't tell you what they know, but they can sort of knock down things that aren't true, and they can sort of lead you kind of in that direction. What I took from some of those conversations was a sense that the president, when he met with the Saudis and the Emiratis, especially the Saudis, said, you need to take a leadership role in fighting extremism. And I haven't heard this from anybody who was in the meeting, but I assume that they said something about the Qataris. And I assume the president said, yeah, that's bad. And they took it as getting carte blanche to move against the Qataris. What it seems to me is that we have a keen interest in not having our friends fighting with each other. Our largest Middle East military base is in Qatar. We have large bases in other surrounding countries. The Gulf Cooperation Council is a helpful way both for the United States to keep all the countries in the region on our side, to keep there from being an arms race, to keep the Iranians on their side of the Gulf. I think breaking apart of the Gulf Cooperation Council isn't good. And what I think we're moving toward is toward a more active U.S. mediation. But this is a new U.S. administration. They're still trying to figure out how to work with each other. And I think it's slow, but it feels to me like we are on a course where the U.S. is going to find a way to mediate this problem. But exactly what's the cause of the problem? The cause of the problem seems to be there was tension between the Saudis and the Qataris for 25 years, and the Saudis seem to have seen an opening with the president, and they took it.
Several questions about to what degree the U.S. should be involved and what would happen if there was a pullout.
From the Middle East. The United States imports less and less oil from the Middle East than it did. And I think there are a lot of people who say, okay, so we're done, right? I mean, let somebody else deal with that stuff. But while we don't directly import oil from the Middle East, we indirectly import oil from the Middle East. This is a phone which was made in Asia with energy from the Middle East, because Japan and Korea get 80% of their oil from the Middle East. And if you're going to be serious about Asia, Asia is serious about the security of the Middle East because that's where their energy comes from. And if the U.S. isn't going to be serious about the Middle East, that doesn't just affect the U.S. in the Middle East, it affects the U.S. in Europe, it affects the U.S. in Asia, it affects the U.S. everywhere. We have to think about what role we want to play in the world, and I think we have this absolutely spectacular advantage that we have actual allies. Like somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the world's GDP is produced by our friends. And somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the world's military might is held by us and our friends. We have this advantage in having influence everywhere in the world, and I think we benefit from that advantage. We benefit from sustaining it. And I think if we're going to sustain our power anywhere in the world, we have to have a position in the Middle East, not just because of what we directly do, but because of what we indirectly do.
A lot of questions. What about Israel?
When my dad was in medical school, he was very concerned because his physiology exam, he was preparing to study, and the question the year before was, discuss milk. It's kind of the same question, isn't it? Discuss Israel. How much time do you have? Look, I think we think of Israel very much in terms of the Arab-Israeli conflict and a peace deal to end the Arab-Israeli conflict. I think a lot of Israelis have decided that that's not only too hard, it's too divisive, and it doesn't actually get you peace. Because a lot of Israelis complain bitterly, there's no partner to make peace with. And they say, land for peace, you give up real land, and you don't get real peace. You get a bunch of words from people who aren't serious about upholding them. So to a remarkable degree, I think, there's very little discussion about Arab-Israeli issues in Israel. And they want to talk about issues that try to bring people together politically, which is often the threat from Iran or something else, or their internal issues. Israel is a very dynamic society. It's a complex society. Israel is trying to struggle to overcome its diversity, which has to do both with religious and secular schisms and ethnic origin of people and Arabs and Jews and all kinds of things. I think Israel's remarkably resilient. It's remarkably complicated. But we Americans tend to see it in a very narrow way. And we try to pick good guys and bad guys. It seems to me that the thing to pay attention to with Israel is just how dynamic a society is, and I think we need to reorient. One of my friends, an Israeli diplomat who's now an ambassador, used to complain that the Israel that most Americans are in love with is an Israel that ceased to exist in 1958. And there's a real dynamic society out there. And I think as Americans, we need to appreciate the positive and negative, the tensions. It's not a perfect country, but it sure is an interesting one.
A lot of questions about the State Department, the cutbacks, how they are being affected in the Middle East, what your contacts think. Are we learning the lesson of Libya by not letting a competent person just go ahead and go ahead?
The best description of the State Department has been conveyed to me by my old boss, Bill Burns, who became the Deputy Secretary of State after I helped his career along, I'm sure. And his way of describing things is, so we tried to get them to do what wasn't their first instinct to do. Right? Everybody thinks about the State Department as they're making concessions and they're being nice to nasty people. The point of the State Department is to get people to do what they walk into a meeting not wanting to do. And that's a really helpful set of talents to have. When I talk to my friends, and my friends in the State Department tend to be very outspoken people who've done a lot of really hard things. And what always impresses me is their ability to say, okay, this is what we want to have happen in 2 years. So what are the building blocks to get there? And how do you move them incrementally? And what's impressed me about the State Department isn't this sort of blandishments and the soft talk. It's that when you talk to America's best diplomats, not all of them are the best, but when you talk to America's best diplomats, they are working to get people to do what the United States government wants them to do that they don't want to do, and hopefully at the end of the day, they're going to do it. And that's a really important skill to have, and it's important to have it not just because you can pound people with the military. It's important to get them to say, you know what, we agree, and that's the direction we're going to move in. I think Secretary Tillerson, who I've spoken to several times before he took office, is a very thoughtful guy. He has not had a lot of in-depth exposure to the State Department. I think the way the building is set up, he has not gotten White House approval to staff up with all of the experts who would be the interface between him and the bureaucracy. And I think the sooner he does that, the better served he will be, because there's a tremendous amount of expertise, and I think he needs conduits to access it.
What about your outlook on Turkey and the Kurds and the implications for NATO and Russia? That's another 15-minute question, and now you only have 10.
I'm very concerned about the U.S.-Turkish relationship. Turkey has been moving a lot in the last several decades, not only economically, which is the tremendous success story, but politically and socially. Turkey is a NATO ally with which we increasingly have fundamental differences about strategy, and one of those is about the Kurds. And Turkey not only feels threatened by Kurdish independence generally because the eastern part of Turkey is heavily Kurdish, but they've been quite agitated by the fact that some of the most effective troops fighting ISIS in Syria are aligned with the PKK, which is a terrorist group of Kurds that the Turkish government has been fighting a battle against for decades. So I hope that we find a way to manage this and resolve it. The reality, I think, is that the deal we had with Turkey was with a different Turkey that had different security concerns. And I am hopeful we can keep it together and keep NATO together, but I think this is going to be a harder job in the next 10 years than it's been the last 10, and it was harder in the last 10 than it was before that. Don't forget, President Obama made building a closer US-Turkey relationship one of his most important priorities when he came into office. He spoke to President Erdogan, I think then Prime Minister, more than he spoke to any foreign leader, and by the end, there were no conversations. I mean, the countries are going different directions right now.
What about the role of religion and religious divisions?
I'm against religious divisions. No, I mean, to me, there are a lot of people who want to use Islam as your explanation for a lot of things. I don't know what Islam, when you use it that way, means. And it's made more complicated by the fact that it's really anathema in Islam to talk about varieties of Islam. The fact is, there are lots of different people coming from a single point of inspiration who take that inspiration to come out in really different places. Some of them, I think, condone violence. Some of them support violence. A lot of them think violence is horrible. How Muslims reconcile these differences, how they decide where the boundaries are between what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, how they manage interpretations, I think is something for Muslims. I've been in too many meetings in Washington where Americans are convinced that they understand Islam better than Muslims understand Islam, and we're going to tell them what their religion really says. I think the reality is their religion says a lot of things. It says a lot of things. But what we often lose sight of is how many remarkable Muslims there are, not only around the world, but in the United States. And American citizens who are serious about Islam, who worry about their kids, and who worry about extremism, and who think that Islam is about providing a warm family environment and all the things that everybody else thinks that religion should be about. I don't think Islam ends up being as helpful a category as people think. Now, what happens is there's some people who want to use the slogans and symbols of Islam to make them seem legitimate, right? Because here you have an ancient religion. You say, well, I will whip out some texts and look at this, and it's not just me. It's what the Prophet Muhammad said 1,400 years ago, and you have no alternative but to kill these people, or whatever it is. You have no alternative but to tell women they have to cover, or however you want to cover. But it seems to me that actually is the beginning of a conversation and not the end of it. And to me, the problem is that too often we see when people play the Islam card, whether it's them or us, it's intended to be the end of the conversation. It needs to be the beginning of one.
What effect does the negative traditions that have to do with women, our view that women are repressed in Arab countries, what does that have to do with the future of?
So, for a while, I used to say that all of the most impressive Arabs I knew were women, and they all covered their hair. That's not entirely true, it's largely true. There are a spectacular array of really talented Arab women who are educated and articulate and ambitious. And there's a way in which, especially in this sort of patriarchal system, the guys kind of sometimes sit back and say, well, I'll be taken care of because my family will take care of me and they'll get me a job. The women don't have anybody taking care of them. And a lot of them are go-getters, and they're smart and they're creative, and they come into contact with a Western society, and it inspires them to do all kinds of really neat things. I can't predict the way women's roles will change, but I can tell you women's roles in the Middle East are changing spectacularly quickly. If you go back and forth to the Middle East, I think, not something I would wish on a lot of people here, but I do it for you. You notice two things. One is, in a lot of places, women covering their hair has become almost universal. In places like Egypt and Jordan, it used to be fairly uncommon. It's now become almost universal. When I was an election observer in Egypt in 2011, I was in the Bahira province, which is northeast of Cairo, but well far away from Alexandria. And in a week of observing elections, I saw 3 women who didn't cover their hair. 2 of them were right outside of a church, and 1 of them was obviously mentally ill. And every other woman I saw was covering her hair. So I think that the hair covering is becoming universal, but the other thing is women's roles are changing. Women are taking education and finding ways to create space, finding ways to use communications, to create businesses, to network with each other. They're very supportive of each other in many cases. There's incredible things going on with women. I can't tell you how the male-female interactions will look, but I can tell you the female-female interactions are much more interesting, much more powerful, much more dynamic, and I think that trend is going to continue in the years to come.
I have a whole bunch of questions I really wanted to ask, but I'm going to choose the one that I chose for the last question. What are the sources of hope in facing this storm? What are the equivalents of your chainsaws?
I think we misjudged the Arab Spring. There are a lot of people who said, look, game over, we've won, right? I mean, Egyptians come out into the streets and they love their country and we love our country, so they're just like us, so they're going to look for a solution like us. And so we're done with the problem of tyranny in the Middle East. Let's move on to another issue. And that was wrong. But what we should pay attention to from that experience is just how creative people can be, how liberated people can be when they can create and communicate by themselves. How the Egyptian revolution brought together Muslims and Christians, religious and secular, rich and poor. I think we need to take those few weeks not as a sign of we were foolishly optimistic, but a sign of what has always been there and will always be there. And the question is, how does it morph? How does it change? I have met the most incredible, I've met Saudis who set up science fairs in elementary schools to teach kids the scientific method. To just get kids to experiment, to have fun, to be creative. I mean, there are people throughout the region who are doing all kinds of neat things. The fact is, you don't meet them in discussions about the Iranian threat. You don't meet them in 5-star hotels. A lot of people who do the Middle East, allegedly, never meet them. But there's a reality of dynamism out there in a young population that is exposed in a way that no population in the world has been exposed before. And I think out of that are going to come a lot of things, not just the things that scare us, but the things that inspire us. And I think we are certain to see more of it over the next 10 years.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jon Alterman.
Thank you.